Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer Fantasy lore. It occurred to me that I haven't really covered the subject of chaos for a while, and so today I'm gonna remedy that with the topic of chaos weaponry, and also demon weapons as well. The two both fulfill more or less the same purpose: bludgeoning, slashing, stabbing, or otherwise eviscerating those who do not accept the glorious light and beneficiaries of chaos undivided. But the weapon's substance and their creation process are quite different. It's a bit of a broad overgeneralization, but a chaos weapon is something that has been created in the real world, in the old world of the Warhammer Fantasy universe, by a mortal smith. Oh, well, mostly, usually by a mortal smith. Exceptions do apply, as always with chaos. Whereas a demon weapon, that is something forged entirely within the realms of the dark gods in the Immaterium. Hellblade spat forth on the soul-fuel furnaces of Khorne, and honed on the essences of the lost and the damned. Fortunately for the rest of us, actual, real demon weaponry simply cannot exist in the material universe. A sword forged literally in the bowels of hell can only exist in the real world once it is wielded by a demonic entity, and even then only in an area already suffused by the powers of chaos, making real demon weapons about as common as GW price cuts. Hell, by that standard, chaos weapons are a dime a dozen. I'd be surprised if you didn't trip across at least 7 heading outside of the door next morning. Although, all joking aside, chaos weapons themselves, depending on how broad you wish to make the definition, are not common either. Although, again, that depends on your definition. Technically speaking, every single weapon forged north of Kislev, essentially, in Norska, in the Chaos Waste, or in Hung territory to the east, is a chaos weapon. And not because of any particular intentions, or runic inscriptions, or ancient rituals sung over the blade as it hardens, or anything like that. They are chaos weapons because of the metal they are crafted from, because of the water they are quenched in, and because of the fire in which they are forged. The land to the north is so completely suffused in the raw energies of chaos to the point that it is in the ground, it is in the water, it is in the trees turned into charcoal, it is in the very air itself, it is everywhere. This is also demonstrated in these northern barbarians' ability to craft weapons and armor of a quality that would impress even the finest weaponsmiths in the soft southern countries. There is a particularly interesting mention in Liber Chaotica, where our main character heading northward is talking about a guide from a local tribe. And he mentions that although this guide is nothing more than a novice smith by the standards of the north, he could churn out armor plating as capable of deflecting a blow from a sword or a cudgel as anything crafted by the finest master artisans in Altdorf. Now, I'm sure there's probably a degree or two of exaggeration in that statement, but the fact remains that the Norscan raiders that come down the coast to the Empire, to Bretonnia, possess weaponry capable of defeating even plate armor. And then, of course, there's the protection worn by the warriors of chaos themselves. Mighty monsters of men encased in full covering plate armor that make a mockery out of crossbows and even gunpowder weaponry. It seems an irrefutable fact that the metals hauled from the cold ground of Norska is simply tougher, harder, and sharper than anything that can be manufactured down south, despite, again, I also point out, the South having far more advanced manufacturing methods. One look at the beautifully crafted, interlocking Gothic-style plate armor of the Empire shows you that they possess a high degree of sophistication in the working of steel and metals. And there should be no question whatsoever that the forges of Altdorf should be able to produce steel at a much higher quality than anything that some random forge master working with a wood-fueled furnace in Norska could ever dream of achieving. And yet, reality seems to suggest something quite different. Now, this is not to say that every weapon forged in Norska, or further north thereof, is of superlative quality, automatically better than anything crafted in the forges down south, far from it. The overwhelming majority of blacksmiths in Norska have little to no real understanding of the metallurgic aspects of the science of their craft. They have been taught by the blacksmith before them, who was taught by the blacksmith before them. It is almost a ritual to them, a tradition, a certain set way of doing things. One blacksmith will hammer out a crude sword shape much like his predecessor did, then sharpen it in the exact same way without any understanding of the process of tampering or hardening or of alloying. There are several mentions, for example, of the weapons of the Northmen being surprisingly fragile, snapping and breaking easily, suggesting that they are crafted from some crude iron, high in carbon and silicates, resulting in a very brittle blade. Even if the sword itself is razor sharp, that's not going to help the wielder overmuch if it cracks and shatters easily. But, whilst again not every weapon crafted will automatically be better than those made by professional artisans who utilize the science of metallurgy to help them form their own weapons, it does mean that those who truly understand the workings of metal, either through lengthy traditions, through own experimentation, or perhaps through raw, God-given talent, these few and rare master craftsmen can produce weapons and armor of a quality unimaginable in the southern lands. And these exceptional individuals can also take the arms they forge another step down the path of lethality as well. It is one thing to craft a steel sword that is simply sharper, lighter, and tougher than any steel sword has any right to be due to the unnatural properties of the earth in which the metal has rested, or the fire created from the fuel burned in the furnace, etc. It is an entirely different thing to create a true chaos weapon. This is where we get to the interesting part. You see, in the north, the names of a champion's weapon is almost as famous as the champion himself. And with good reason, since these weapons are unique masterpieces that simply cannot ever be reproduced. Each sword, each spear, each cudgel, each lance, brought forth by a unique set of circumstances, tools, material, and skill. In the making of such a thing, the smith places a part of himself within the blade, a part of his essence, his soul, and in some cases, considerably more than a portion, and perhaps considerably more than one smith as well. More often than not, weapons of this terrifying level of potency have been crafted for a specific purpose, often via the direct intervention of the chaos deities, infusing a mortal servant with the skills, the knowledge, and the drive necessary to create the weapon. In the cases of the greatest champions of the gods, they may even receive weapons that were predestined for them, as plans, millennia in the making, are all set into motion. The creation of armor, the forging of a sword, the birth of a horse, etc., all intended to arm, armor, and equip a chosen of the dark gods. But of course, we've gone from one extreme to the other, have we not? The overwhelming majority of chaos weapons are something in between, in the middle of the crude axe blade forged by a no-name smith on the coast of Norska, and the weapon crafted for an Archon the Ever-Chosen. The form, shape, and abilities of these middle-of-the-road weapons can vary greatly. It's chaos we're talking about here, after all, and there are many examples of weapons that are not mere weapons either, that are made for a specific purpose, again perhaps as a part of a greater plan. The Kraken Slayer is one such example, a sword that allows its wielder to breathe underwater. The man who wielded this weapon supposedly grasped it from the brow of a kraken, and after having swum back up to the surface, led his tribe on a migration northwards, spreading a great deal of destruction and annihilation in his wake, before finally reaching the shores of the Sea of Claws, and then simply ordering his warband to disperse as he walked confidently into the sea, never to be seen again. Another example might be the King Sword. A rather unique one, this. A sword with an intelligence. A weapon that wielded the wielder. This sword took a portion of its wielder's soul and bound it to its own immortal will, essentially dominating the person. It became the heirloom weapon of a tribe for many generations. Each new chief would accept the weapon of the old and slice his palm with it. Thusly, the sword drank of the blood of the new chieftain and bound his soul to itself, creating yet another puppet. The sword's intelligence was eventually revealed, but so what? It was an artifact of the gods. The person who revealed the sword's malignant intent was chased out of the village, not to be seen again for many decades, after which the sword simply threw off the charade of humans and ruled the village and the tribe as simply a sword. After 50 years, the man once thrown out would return at the head of his own Chaos Warband, attack the village, steal the sword, and plunge it inside of his own belly, after having tied himself to his horse, a demonic warhorse possessed of infinite stamina, and he ordered the horse to simply keep running for all eternity, never stopping, never pausing, and never allowing him to fall from its back. A Pyrrhic victory, to be sure, but a victory nonetheless. Other weapons are less unique, less esoterical and willful. They simply kill things very well. There was one sword crafted from the tail of a mighty Chaos Champion's pet cockatrice. It has the ability to turn anyone sliced by its edge into solid stone, as if they had been exposed to the monster itself. Another famous example would be the Black Axe of Krell, wielded by the now undead champion. This two-handed axe blade has the ability to regenerate itself, and every time it hits metal, tiny little slivers of the weapon, little shards, will break off inside of the victim's body, and then through some horrific malign intelligence worm their way into the victim's vital organs, thereby slaying them. Oof. being killed by slivers of living metal has got to be a pretty brutal way to go. Then again, that assumes you survive getting hit by a two-handed axe in the first place. Artifacts such as these would probably represent the mid-range of chaos weaponry. They're not world-enders, but nor are they by any stretch of the imagination normal weapons. And their creation undoubtedly requires considerable preparation, specialized unique tools. For example, perhaps the runes inscribed in the weapon can only be carved using a chisel forged itself from the blood of dwarves and tipped with a diamond crafted from a demon's tears, or other such fanciful nonsense. Perhaps the weapon can only be crafted during a particular point of time, during a particular moon phase, or even a particular event, a prophesized one mayhaps. Like a dagger that can only be made during an eclipse on the 30th year of the birth of a tiny little piglet with tentacles growing out of its back. And voila, you've got yourself a living whip, for some reason. It doesn't even necessarily need to have a specific reason behind it, it just needs to have significance. Chaos thrives on significance, the importance people attribute to certain things. Quenching a blade in blood rather than water, for example, that has a significance. Carving runes meant to make a weapon sharper, that has significance. Not because of the nature of the blood or the shape of the rune, but because people have attributed that ability to those things. Chaos is whatever mortal beings think, feel, and form it into. This, of course, all means that such an item requires a long time to create. The time needs to be just right. The correct tools, the correct materials need to all be gathered. Perhaps the correct location needs to be set up. Maybe the weapon can only be made with the sacrifice of X amount of slaves. Maybe the weapon can only be made whilst an adoring crowd stand around whooping and cheering. I would hardly put such a demand beyond Slanesh, for example. The point is, this all requires a great deal of sophistication, of knowledge, of understanding, of research, or, again, simply just divine inspiration. Most weaponsmiths, however, will not possess this, though they will perhaps be able to boast about other knowledge. There is a lower registry of chaos weaponry too. Not simply the crude axes of a random blacksmith, but those enhanced or enchanted in some way or form. For example, let us say that a particularly ancient smith has noticed that if he cools his sword in a particular mixture of piss and offal, favoured by Nurgle, then the weapon permanently leaks a thin sheen of some form of septic fluid. Voila, you have yourself a poisoned weapon that reapplies its viciousness continuously. Or maybe, long in the path, a smith was taught a certain rune from a mysterious wandering traveller that never quite raised his hood, and ever since he's been passing down this star-shaped rune to his apprentices. And lo and behold, when you hammer it into steel, it makes the weapon almost move as if it had a will of its own, not overpowering, but just enough to nudge the wielder's arm in the right direction, to slip the blade into and between chinks in armor or past an enemy's guard. This might all seem like pretty low-level stuff compared to the nonsense we were talking about earlier, like, the sword that runs the goddamn village. But it's pretty damn useful, having a sword that, by itself, automatically guides you towards the enemy's weak points, yeah, that's going to give you a bit of an advantage, isn't it? And therefore, this knowledge and the people who has it are wildly sought after. A skilled blacksmith is a very popular individual in Norska and can expect quite the salary, not to mention the other perks as well. Now, let us wrap it up with the topic of demon weaponry as well. This will be a bit of a shorter one in all due reality because we don't know that much about demon weapons. We don't even know if there's really any limitations placed upon them. We do know that there is some uniformity. For example, the hell blades used by bloodletters of Khorne. They all seem to be large swords of some sort or another, and they also seem to be, again, perhaps even demonic entities in their own right. Because once the bloodletter is killed, the weapon too disappears. It might even be entirely possible that the sword is nothing more than a part of the bloodletter. Though we do know that some weapons, like the mighty axes of Khorne and the barbed whips of the bloodthirsters, those are badges of office, almost, signs of status and favor, and are a bit more unique. There are even items of more, how do I put it, utilitarian purposes, like the spiked iron collars worn by the fleshhounds of Khorne. They have the ability to dissipate magic aimed at the fleshhound, or psychic powers, depending upon the universe. Though, once more, you could easily argue that it may simply just be a part of the demon rather than a separate entity or item. You could even go so far as to say that a demon weapon is not the weapons wielded by demons as all, since they are merely just another aspect of the demon itself, but instead we should classify those chaos weapons that has an entity within them as demon weapons. The King's Sword, for example, was undoubtedly inhabited by some form of warp entity. And we know for a fact that the Slayer of Kings, the sword of the Ever-Chosen himself, entraps a greater demon, Uzul, who has long wished to get free of his prison. But personally, I do feel that the distinction is worth making. A chaos weapon, no matter how powerful, has been crafted and created in the real world, allowing it to stay there without a constant supply of warp energies. And in the case of a demonic entity inside the weapon, it was either trapped there or volunteered to enter it. I suspect the latter is far more unlikely than the former, however, whereas a true demon weapon is an entity of the warp. Perhaps it would be more correct to refer to it as a creature in its own right than merely a weapon, but since it takes the form of one, we'll call the demon duck, at least for now. And on that riveting debate about definitions, I shall leave you once more. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.